History Board, and I am a proud member of the Matriots, where I serve as co-chair of membership and a member of the executive committee. I am pleased to be joined by friends and colleagues and event partners. Kim Crawford-Swade, she is the Matriots Interim Executive Director, and you can probably see Kim, I see you at the upper left-hand of the screen. Brady Kress, President and CEO of Dayton History, and Brady is top line. And Diane Herman, the coordinator of the Speakers Bureau for the League of Women Voters in the greater Dayton area. Our three organizations have joined forces to acknowledge August 2020 is the 100th anniversary of white women being granted the right to vote. We have a great program for you this evening, so as more of you join us and as we see more familiar faces, please grab your favorite beverage and sit back and let's hear from the Matriots, Dayton History, and the League of Women Voters, our partners, and take a look back to Montgomery County's role in suffrage and to look forward to what equity and parity might look like for women in political office. So it is my pleasure to introduce our outstanding community leader and president and CEO of Dayton History, Brady Kress, who will give us a 10-minute discussion and an overview of a video on Dayton's suffrage history. And so Brady, I'm going to turn it over to you and welcome everyone. And please feel comfortable. We are going to ask if you would like to make a comment to use the chat box. And Kim, over the course of the evening, we will be making comments from your questions and statements in the chat box. And for those of you who have ever worked for elected officials, I'm sure you can appreciate that the staff role is something you just never grow out of. And I just have to say hello to Commissioner Bootsy Neal, who was such a lovely and wonderful person to work with. So Bootsy, welcome. And you have a program tomorrow on gerrymandering with former Mayor Ryan McClin, Dayton Mayor Ryan McClin. And I hope many of those on the call will be able to join you and Ryan talking about gerrymandering tomorrow. So Brady, please take us to the next discussion point, and that is the history of suffrage in Dayton, Ohio.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Valerie, and thanks to everyone here that's joining us. Of course, we wish you could all be here at Carillon Historical Park in Dayton. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're a 65-acre open-air museum. We have 32 historic structures here, and we tell very unique stories about the entire region. Also here is the Wright Brothers National Museum. We hold about 3 million items in our collection. A large portion of those come from the NCR, the National Cash Register corporate archive. And so because of that, a fair majority of our stories are about industry, invention, and transportation. But even though we don't delve a lot into social history, we do have a temporary exhibit gallery that we added a few years ago. We've been able to highlight a number of stories through that gallery. One of them over the years, around the death, 100-year centennial of Wilbur Wright's death, we did an exhibit there. Did one on Ohio and southwestern Ohio during the Civil War. Finished one a few years ago dealing all about this region during World War I. And now it's our pleasure to talk about and share some of the local stories as we approach the 100th anniversary of the 18th and the 19th Amendments. So we have an exhibit that we've put together, talks about the prohibition and suffrage. And so very shortly here, we're going to have one of our curators, Steve Look, take you through just that piece, just the suffrage piece of our exhibit, and talk about how a lot of those things were connected from World War I and in conjunction with really stemming from the Civil War and then World War I, and then stemming from Prohibition, how suffrage really came to be, and the ratification of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. So we're excited to share that with you. Later, we'll see one of our historic interpreters, Rachel, portraying a Dayton woman in 1913 rushing to hear a suffrage speech. And even though Rachel is going to be portraying a fictional character, everything she talks about is part of the historic record here in Dayton in 1913. So we hope you enjoy that. Dayton History in Carillon Park, we're very pleased to provide this historic content for tonight's event. And we hope you will all visit Carillon Park soon. I will tell you, on a personal note, I'm very excited about this. As we were putting this together, it reminded me very much of my own grandmother, who was 23 years old when the 19th Amendment was ratified. And from that point, she was always involved. And even though her party affiliations swung wildly back and forth over the next 70 years, one of her favorite photographs that she had was of her with the president and the first lady in the Rose Garden at the White House. And she always treasured that. And so no matter how she voted from election to election, she was always thrilled to be part of the process. And so hopefully we can inspire others to do the same tonight. So thank you.
All right, shall I kick off our suffrage exhibit? Okay.
Please enjoy. Yep.
Here we are.
Hello, welcome to the Bootleggers, Bandits, and Badges exhibit here at Carillon Historical Park. We're excited to have you here today because not only does this exhibit talk about temperance and how that led to prohibition nationally, but we also talk about suffrage, the suffrage movement, and the enactment of the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote in 1920. Both movements unified nationally after the Civil War. The temperance movement, they started in 1874 with the creation of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And then the suffrage movement, they actually formed two separate groups because they had differing opinions about how to achieve women's suffrage. In 1869, they both formed. One was the National Women's Suffrage Association, and the other one was the American Women's Suffrage Association. These two organizations merged in 1890 to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they did have their cause as being temperance from the get-go in 1874. But in 1879, their mission broadened quite a bit. They went from just the one issue of temperance to over 30 issues, social reform issues that they really focused on. Some of those issues included prison reforms, worker welfare reforms, free kindergartens for children. One of the social reforms they also embraced was, of course, suffrage. They did that formally in 1881 at their national convention. And the reason they felt suffrage was very important to work on was because they felt that the WCTU felt that women's suffrage was critical to them in achieving all their social reform goals. So they took it on. Now, but of course, nationally, not all women were for suffrage. Some were very kind of unsure about it. Some were outright opposed to it, thought women should not be in that political public sphere, that was really just for men. So Frances Willard, in order to kind of encourage some of the WCTU members who were lukewarm or opposed to suffrage to get them on board with it, she framed the idea of women's suffrage in the context of what she called home protection. And her argument was that women needed to protect themselves and their children from the evils of the world, and that the women's right to vote was critical to the protection of the home and the family. And so therefore, a lot of the women who were members of the WCTU who were kind of against or unsure of women's suffrage, they got on board with that argument. They saw the logic in that argument. So they got on board, and so the WCTU started working closely with the National American Women's Suffrage Association to bring about the women's right to vote. The WCTU set up franchise departments in cities all across the United States to work closely with the local and state suffrage movement boards and organizations. And so they would do lobbying and petitioning. They would put on suffrage plays. They would pass out literature to people to advocate for women's suffrage. They would host public debates and also just bring in speakers to talk about women's suffrage. And in this area in the exhibit, we talk about how the two movements and the two organizations kind of really work together to bring about women's suffrage. We have a sash, an authentic sash that was worn by Dayton suffragettes here in Dayton. A photograph of course, some Dayton women who marched in the suffrage parade in Columbus in order to advocate for women's suffrage. And then it's a wonderful photograph of women learning how to vote. Because after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the League of Women Voters was created, and of course there was a need to kind of start educating women on the political process and what it means and how to vote and things like that. So this is actually some photographic training that NCR conducted in order to teach women how to use the ballot box. This gentleman right here is the president of the National Cash Register Company at that time. He was very much one of the progressive industrialists in the nation. He was a leader in terms of worker welfare reform, and he really saw the importance of women's rights. And so he poured a lot of his money and some of his time into supporting the local suffrage organizations here in Dayton. So ironically, though, one of John Patterson's female relatives, Julia Shaw Patterson Carnell, was opposed to women's suffrage. She thought that, among like many others, that it was counter to their delicate nature and that it would do more harm than good to the family. And of course, then again, also that women should not be involved in that public, the dirty, awful public sphere, political sphere that men were involved in. Dayton was a very progressive industrial city. Over half of NCR's workforce was made up of women. And a lot of women were being employed in other factories throughout the Dayton area, even before World War I. And that quite possibly, led the overall citizenry of Dayton to accept suffrage more quickly, possibly than other cities in the United States. In 1914, we had the creation of Dayton's first police women's bureau. And then as you come into World War I, as men are being sent off to war, millions and millions of men, Dayton, like again other industrial cities, started employing women to work in the factory. And with that, you had more and more independence growing among women in society, seeing and recognizing the important contributions that women can make to society. And that, of course, led to the higher levels of government. So by around 1917, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson was also advocating, he was for women's suffrage. He was essentially a staunch opponent to it early on, but as he saw how women's contributions to society at large were so important during World War I, he also saw that they needed to have more of a place within the political public sphere. And so he advocated for women's suffrage, and of course that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment ultimately.
All right, are we back?
Yes, we are. And I think Brady is going to just give us a few brief details about the exhibit, and he is going to then introduce Diane.
Wonderful.
Yes, well, you know, as was mentioned, the exhibit is open. It's open for probably about another year, so plenty of time to come and see it. Again, we had wished you were all here at the park to be able to see that yourself. Sorry about the rough audio on that video, but hopefully got a little taste of what's here at the park and what's in that exhibit, and we hope to have all of you join us soon. So I believe Valerie, we have Diane that's going to be giving us a slideshow.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yes.
Talk about the history.
Yes, and I can go into it in more depth.
Great.
With more detail.
Diane, welcome.
With the overview that you all from Caroline showed us. So the history of women's suffrage in the United States is actually the story of one of the greatest social movements in American history. As one historian has written, the struggle for women's voting rights was one of the longest, most successful, and in some respects, most radical challenges ever posed to the American system of electoral politics. And I think we have a slideshow that goes with this.
Yes, indeed. One moment, and I'll bring that up. Sorry, it's hiding from me. There we are. One second. Sorry about that. My computer seems to be lagging with the screen share. Hold on just a moment. Let me try one more time. Sometimes Zoom can be a bit challenging. I'm sure you guys have experienced this as well. First we had sound issues, and now there we are. Let's try that. Okay.
Here we go.
Sorry about that. All right.
I think we're on the next slide now. Okay. So the achievement of the vote for women was extraordinarily difficult and took generations to succeed. As Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Schuler stated about the protracted effort by the suffragists, quote, hundreds of women gave the accumulated possibilities of an entire lifetime. Thousands gave years of their lives. Hundreds of thousands gave constant interest in such aid as they could. It was a continuous, seemingly endless chain of activity. Young suffragists who helped forge the last links of that chain were not born when it began. Old suffragists who forged the first links were dead when it ended. We have the next slide.
Yes.
Catt recounted the amount of human effort involved from the time the first woman's suffrage amendment was introduced in Congress in 1868. Over 52 years, women conducted 56 campaigns of referenda to male voters, 480 campaigns to get legislatures to submit suffrage amendments to voters, 47 campaigns to get state constitutional conventions to write women's suffrage into state constitutions, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions to include women's suffrage planks in party platforms, and 19 campaigns with 19 successive Congresses. And the next slide. And although there were stirrings of change to address the unsatisfactory position of women in a changing world at the beginning of the 19th century, the spark that started the movement was ignited at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. The Americans had sent a delegation, including women who were active in the abolitionist movement in the US. When the convention ruled that only men should be seated, among the women compelled to sit passively during the 10-day convention were Lucretia Mott and the young wife of an abolitionist leader, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The irony that women who were active in the great reform movements of the day were rebuffed and not allowed to officially participate led many, such as the Grimke sisters, who were gifted public speakers on the issue of slavery, to argue that the question of equality for women was not a matter of abstract justice, but must be undertaken so that women could be enabled to join in the urgent task of social reform, especially the fight to abolish slavery. It was in the abolitionist movement that women first learned to organize, to hold public meetings, to conduct petition campaigns, and finally, to advocate for their rights. So in 1848, Mott, Stanton, and 3 other Quaker women decided to call a women's rights convention at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, where Mrs. Stanton lived, to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. There was plenty of lively discussion and many resolutions were introduced and passed unanimously, except for one, which was carried by only a small margin, being considered too radical at the time. Quote, resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Even Mrs. Mott felt that this proposal would make the women reformers look ridiculous. But some supported Mrs. Stanton, including Frederick Douglass, the great Black abolitionist, who approved of Mrs. Stanton's daring proposal. Conventions continued to be held, with the first National Women's Rights Convention held in 1850. With the outbreak of the Civil War, all activities for women's rights ground to a standstill, while the efforts of the leaders of the women's cause were directed to the abolitionist issue. After the Civil War, some women's rights leaders saw winning the vote as the most important of their goals. Enfranchisement, they believed, was essential, both as a symbol of women's equality and individuality and as a means of improving women's legal and social condition. They were extremely disappointed, therefore, when the 14th and 15th Amendments did not provide the vote for all Americans, but extended the franchise only to Black men. As the earlier abolitionist movement had looked skeptically on women's rights campaign, lest it impair their fight to end slavery. So after the Civil War, many suffragists felt betrayed as they were told now it was the Negro's hour. And this led to the fracturing of the women's rights cause in 1869 over the issues of whether or not to support ratification of the 15th Amendment. The National Woman Suffrage Association was headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who opposed the 15th Amendment, but called for a 16th Amendment that would enfranchise women. The other organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association, was led by Lucy Stone with the aid of her husband, Henry Blackwell. They supported ratification of the 15th Amendment. While supporting women's suffrage, they adopted a more gradualist approach. They focused their efforts on educational campaigns to make women's suffrage appear less radical, and stressed reform efforts at the state, not the federal level, and promoted partial suffrage, legislation allowing women to vote on local, school, and state issues. After the Civil War, and with the explosion of statehood in the West, Utah and Wyoming adopted women's suffrage, while still territories, and maintained this position when admitted to the Union. Wyoming approved women's suffrage in 1890. Other Western states also granted women's suffrage, including Colorado in 1893, Utah and Idaho in 1896. And while there are a variety of factors that explain each Western state's support for women's suffrage, frontier conditions that undermine traditional gender roles and efforts to attract more women residents were major contributors. One of the most important turning points in the history of the women's suffrage movement came in 1890 as the two national suffrage organizations reunited into one major organization. At the instigation of the younger suffragists, the movement's aging pioneers put aside their differences sufficiently to merge their rival organizations into the National American Woman Suffrage Association, otherwise known as NASA, with Stanton, Stone, and Anthony as the principal officers. They also merged their tactics, continuing to demand a federal amendment, but also working to build support within the states, winning enough state suffrage amendments that Congress would approve a federal amendment and that 3/4 of the states would be sure to ratify. As the struggle to win the vote continued after the Civil War and into the turn of the century, the issue of race became even more problematic for the suffragists. We've already seen that the passage of the 15th Amendment, codifying the right of Black men, but not women, to vote led to the split in the women's movement. When the two associations merged, the issue of race did not recede. While the suffrage movement has been historically aligned with the rights of Blacks and the abolishment of slavery, white suffragists increasingly became indignant that Black men won the vote ahead of them. The suffragists also felt that they would need the support of the Southern states if they were to be successful with a federal amendment to the Constitution. With the renewed ascendancy of white supremacy in the South after Reconstruction, the suffragists began using a strategy first suggested by Henry Blackwell. Remember, he was an abolitionist leader. Northern and Southern leaders began to argue that women's suffrage, far from endangering white supremacy in the South, could be a means of restoring it. In fact, they suggested that the adoption of women's suffrage with educational or property qualifications that would disqualify most Black women would allow the South to restore white supremacy in politics without having to disenfranchise Black males and risk congressional repercussions. The National Suffrage Association spent considerable time and resources developing what they called the Southern Strategy, far before Nixon, sending their leaders on speaking tours throughout the region and holding the 1895 Nassau Convention in Atlanta. Eager to avoid offending their Southern hosts, they even asked their aging hero, Frederick Douglass, who was an honored participant in women's rights convention elsewhere in the nation, to stay away from the Atlanta meeting. But pitting one group against another seldom works in either's interests, and it soon became obvious that Southern politicians were not persuaded to destroy women's traditional role as they proceeded to institute Jim Crow laws to block Black male voters' access to the ballot. But despite white suffrage exclusion of African American women from white suffragist organizations, many prominent African Americans actively supported women's suffrage from its very beginning, such as the former slave Sojourner Truth with her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech at one of the first conventions, to Ida B. Wells Barnett, famous as a leading crusader against lynching, and Mary Church Terrell, educator and first president of the National Association of Colored Women. Adela Hunt Logan, Tuskegee faculty member, insisted that if white women needed the vote to protect their rights, then Black women, victims of racism as well as sexism, needed the ballot even more. The turn of the century saw a lull in the movement with no real successes for a decade or so. Suffragists concentrated on state opportunities for suffrage, particularly in the West. Between 1910 and 1912, Washington, California, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona granted women the right to vote, the result of hard-fought campaigns by the suffragists in those states. In 1913, a young suffragist named Alice Paul became active. She organized a large parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., held the day before Woodrow Wilson's first presidential inauguration. She urged the Nassau, now headed by Carrie Chapman Catt, to pressure President Wilson to support the federal amendment. Up to this point, Wilson said that while he personally believed in women's suffrage, he didn't. He thought that the states should decide individually, and thus he could not support passage of the 19th Amendment. Paul and Catt disagreed on strategies and tactics, and Paul formed a separate group, the Congressional Union, which later became the National Woman's Party, to pursue women's suffrage on the federal level using more radical methods. Eventually, seeing the political tides turning, he wasn't persuaded by anything other than political expediency. In 1918, President Wilson changed his tune and urged Congress to pass the Women's Suffrage Amendment. It took another year and the ending of World War I for the amendment to pass, but in June 1919, Congress voted yes and sent it to the states for ratification. The amendment passed with the exact same wording as was written by Susan B. Anthony when it was first presented to Congress 40 years earlier in 1868. Quote, "The right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex," unquote. But the final chapter in the suffrage story was still ahead, as 36 states had to ratify the amendment before it could become law. The final battle took place in Nashville, Tennessee in the long, hot summer of 1920. In that final contest, anti-suffragists as well as suffragists from all over the nation descended upon the state in a bitter struggle over ideology and influence. The anti-suffragists were at an advantage in the hostile South, beating off the dominant culture of white supremacy and states' rights, as well as the support of the liquor industry, the railroads, and other corporate interests. The story of the dramatic ratification, as recounted by Elaine Weiss in The Woman's Hour, describes how one vote won the day as a 24-year-old legislator from the mountains, Harry Byrne, changed his vote from no to yes at the insistence of his elderly mother, Phoebe King Insminger Byrne. In a letter he received at the Capitol before his vote, his mother wrote, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat with lots of love, Mama." The 19th Amendment was officially added to the Constitution on August 26, 1920. The last state to ratify the amendment was Mississippi in 1984. The suffrage movement in Ohio did not develop as rapidly as in several other states. Ohio women held regular meetings until the outbreak of the Civil War and were able to organize the Ohio State Women's Suffrage Association in 1885. They initiated a campaign in 1888 to enroll all persons who endorsed women's suffrage, procuring thousands of signatures. By 1896, numerous towns and cities throughout the state had formed suffrage associations. With the election of Mrs. Harriet Taylor Upton as president of the Ohio Association in 1900, she launched a statewide campaign to organize additional suffrage groups. While pictures do not capture her outgoing personality, she was known for her sense of humor. She was an important actor during this Tennessee ratification fight and was a close confidant of Carrie Chapman Catt. She was also well known to both 1920 presidential candidates, Harding and Cox, both of Ohio, and she attempted to use her influence and connections to these men to garner support. Dayton women formed their first women's suffrage association in 1869, but the organization attracted virtually no general interest and disbanded in 1871. With momentum building nationally in the suffrage movement, they tried again and formed the Dayton Equal Rights Association in 1887. But this group also failed to attract support and disbanded in 1888, when the Ohio legislature voted down a women's suffrage bill. Continued attempts were made at the state level from 1904 to 1910, including resolutions asking the legislature to submit a constitutional amendment providing full suffrage, all of which were unsuccessful. In 1912, Dayton women founded the Women's Suffrage Party of Montgomery County, which later became Women's Suffrage Association of Dayton and Montgomery County. As in other communities, this organization grew out of the proliferation of women's literary clubs. Many of those active in the suffrage campaigns were members of these clubs. Most of them were middle and upper class women who were wives of socially and economically prominent men. The suffragists elected Mrs. Oscar F. Davison as their first president, and she was reelected every year until the vote was won in 1920. She was able to link the local movement with the larger state and national organizations through her work with leaders like Mrs. Harriet Taylor Upton and Carrie Chapman Catt. She was the wife of a prominent lawyer who was also active in civic improvement activities. Other leaders included Mrs. Robert C. Schenck, wife of one of the pioneer industrial leaders of Dayton, who installed the first telephone system in Dayton. Mrs. Valentine Winters was the wife of Dayton's foremost banker. Miss Electra Doran, daughter of the editor of the Cincinnati Enquirer, headed the Dayton Public Library and was responsible for preserving important documents of the local suffragist movement, which are available in a digital collection or in the Dayton room of the downtown branch of the Dayton Metro Library. Some of the city's prominent Black women citizens were also advocates for women's suffrage. Mrs. Joella Higgins was the nation's first African-American Red Cross nurse and helped found Dayton's first YWCA for Black women. Healy Q. Brown was a graduate of Wilberforce University and was a highly respected educator. She was also a gifted orator who gave well-received speeches in significant venues, including international ones. A number of notable Daytonians were in support of women's suffrage. As we've seen before, John H. Patterson, founder of National Cash Register, sought to encourage the suffragists, and he also provided funds for them to establish a headquarters for the Women's Suffrage Association of Dayton and Montgomery County. Patterson also enlisted the support of other reform-minded influential men, such as Colonel Edward Deeds and J.H. Reich. Catherine Wright was very active in local suffrage campaigns, marching with her father Milton and her brother Orville in one of the parades for women's votes in Dayton. Doris Stevens came to Dayton in 1911 to teach high school after graduating from Oberlin. She chronicled the history of the National Woman's Party in her 1920 book, Jailed for Freedom, later made into a film, Iron-Jawed Angels, and described the deplorable treatment of suffragists who were arrested as they picketed the White House. Charlotte Reeve Conover, much respected local historian and author of several books about Dayton and inducted into Dayton's Walk of Fame, was a leader in the Women's Suffrage Party of Montgomery County. Daytonian Dorothy Meade was one of several suffragists who rode the Suffrage Special, a train that carried Alice Paul's Women's Party members across the country in 1916. Dayton also produced some of the most powerful leaders of the opponents, also known as the Antis. The Ohio State Association opposed to women's suffrage was led by Mrs. Harry E. Talbot of Dayton. She belonged to the city's upper class. She was active in religious pursuits and helped found the First Church of Christ Scientists. She also loved music and helped organize the Dayton Symphony Association and the world-renowned Westminster Choir. Her husband was one of Dayton's most prominent businessmen, and he was also Oakwood's first mayor. The most notable campaigns to win the vote in Ohio took place in 1912 and 1914, when the suffragists fought again for an amendment to the state constitution. The Dayton suffragists worked hard on these campaigns. They sponsored open-air meetings and invited national speakers to events. In the 1912 campaign, they distributed 20,000 leaflets. They sent letters to every Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish religious leader attempting to enlist their support. They succeeded in convincing several movie theaters to allow moving picture slides on the suffrage question to be shown in their establishments. They met with employees of National Cash Register and Reich's department store. They rented a small booth in the arcade in an attempt to reach people. They ran a series of advertisements in local newspapers and placed suffrage posters inside Dayton's streetcars. The Dayton Daily News donated full pages of the paper during the campaign to both sides that ran each week before the vote so that the reader could evaluate the differing arguments. Dayton's suffragists appear to have been more dedicated to inclusiveness than was the case for many of the upper and middle class white women in the suffrage movement, who had a history of racism and antagonism to the working class and foreign-born. They sought outreach to Polish and German immigrants, although language was a barrier. Black women ran the suffrage information booth in the arcade one day a week. But the 1912 campaign ended in dismal failure, with Montgomery County registering more opposition than statewide results. Dayton had suffered a disastrous flood in 1913, which claimed many lives and destroyed large segments of the city. But Dayton was still able to send a delegation to the famous 1913 parade in Washington, D.C. In 1914, they tried again, with the Dayton suffragists actively circulating a new petition throughout the state to obtain enough signatures to place a suffrage amendment on the ballot. Although with less enthusiasm and less publicity than the 1912 effort, they were still able to organize a Dayton Women's Parade on October 24, 1914, that drew more than 1,200 men and women participants. Unfortunately, the Antis were able to draw an assembly of 1,000, mostly women, to hear national female speakers make a presentation on why men should not extend the franchise to women. Indeed, unable to overcome the publicity caused by the anti-suffrage rally, the results of the election indicated that they had lost ground, with the votes in Dayton nearly double the margin of the 1912 defeat. Opposition from the foreign vote and the upper classes and apathy and lack of support for women were factors for the defeat. But the suffragists identified their greatest foe as the liquor interests, even though the Dayton suffragists took great pains to advertise that they were absolutely neutral on the issue of prohibition. Although there were overlapping, of course, members in both the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the suffrage movement. But so powerful were the liquor interests in Ohio, being one of the largest brewing states, that they boasted openly that the liquor industry, they said, we are responsible for the defeat of women's suffrage. After the failures in the 1912 and 1914 election locally and throughout the state, suffrage organizations lost momentum and interest in suffrage in the greater Dayton area began to wane. While women were able to gain suffrage in municipal affairs in Cleveland, Lakewood, and Columbus in 1916 and 1917, strong anti-suffrage sentiment prevailed in and around Dayton. While efforts to pass a suffrage law by the Ohio legislature for presidential elections in 1917, known as the Reynolds Bill, were successful, and Governor Cox signed the bill into law, local state elected officials voted against the bill. And the antis, joined by the liquor interests, were successful in initiating a petition which allowed for revocation of the new law. Meanwhile, in 1918, the federal amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote passed the U.S. House of Representatives by an exact 2/3 required majority. The local Democratic representative from Montgomery County, Lewis Gard, voted against the bill. By then, President Wilson appeared before the Senate to appeal for the passage of the 19th Amendment, but the measure failed to muster the necessary 2/3 vote by one vote. Ohio Senator Atlee Pomerene voted against the bill, but Ohio Senator Warren Harding voted for it. Suffragists blamed Senator Pomerene, who had strong ties to the liquor industry, for the defeat. When it finally passed the Senate in June 1919, the Ohio General Assembly wasted no time in ratifying the 19th Amendment, however, on June 16, 1920. Most of the Montgomery County representatives, including those who had opposed suffrage in this 1917 election, voted for the amendment, and the senator representing Montgomery and Preble counties did likewise. Upon Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, under the leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt, transformed itself into the League of Women Voters of the United States, and the Women's Suffrage Association of Dayton and Montgomery County became the local League of Women Voters. The women organized the League for the purpose of studying governmental problems without partisan bias, for the promotion of forward-looking legislation, and the ceaseless efforts for efficient government in city, county, state, and nation. They elected Minnie Stanley, their first president, and she immediately organized classes to help women learn how to vote and understand what issues were on the ballot. As one chronicler of the local suffragist movement stated, quote, "The League of Women of Dayton had struggled tirelessly as suffragists for the right to participate in the democratic system, and now, in possession of the vote, they set out to help reform America." And I can answer any questions people might have.
Well, Diane, thank you so much for your outstanding and informative presentation. We absolutely appreciate it. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask that people put any comments or questions in the chat box. And now I would just like to move the program along so that we have plenty of time for the open discussion and our panel discussion. I would say that everyone, Diane, based on what you've been able to tell us, as well as the history that Dayton and his colleague were able to share, over the ensuing 100 years, much has changed. We have experienced growing political power for women. African-American women were granted full voting privileges under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, having faced barriers to voting after passage of the 15th and the 19th Amendments. A woman of color, Senator Kamala Harris was announced yesterday as vice presidential running mate to VP Joseph Biden. Clearly a historic moment, and I think only the second woman on a major political ticket to stand as vice president after Geraldine Ferraro. Every year, more and more women are standing for public office at all levels of government. Yet women hold just 29% of elected offices in Ohio. Fewer women vote, volunteer to work on political campaigns, or give money to political candidates than do men. So I am pleased to announce that on our call today, we have other Ohio endorsed candidates by the Matriots, and I can see Commissioner Judy Dodge, and Kim, you'll have to tell us if there are others on the call that could be introduced. And Judy, just kind of wave to everyone so they can clearly see you.
So hard to track everyone.
I know.
Right.
So just if we aren't able to see you with all the slides, it's hard to see folks. Just wave your hand. We are just pleased to acknowledge all elected officials and appreciate those that have been endorsed by us and support the principles of the organization. Tonight, however, is an exploration of where we've been and where women will be politically over the next generation and beyond. I'd like to begin now our panel discussion. I will introduce 4 outstanding women who will discuss the historic, contemporary, and possible futures of recruiting and training more women to enter politics and to reflect on what the various impediments and opportunities of doing so include. Their bios will be in the chat box. I will call on them individually and ask them to respond to a question. After they have each responded to a question, we will have an opportunity for you to join in the discussion. Remember to make your comment or ask your question to use the chat box. Kim will then present the questions to the panelists and we'll be able to have I hope, a very interesting discussion. First on the panel today is Janine Moon with the Women's Political Leadership Circle. And Janine, can you tell us, what does persist mean to you and how are you living it?
Thank you, Valerie. Persist, I think in its simplest terms, means keeping on, keeping on. And from a woman's perspective, I believe it means uplifting other women, whether it may be small means or large means. My involvement in women's issues goes back actually 50 years or so to the second wave of feminism with Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, looking to pass the ERA, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, all of those kinds of things. And activities there were kind of aligned with where I was in my life at that time, a lot more active. Through the decades, I think we all change. And depending upon where we are, we uplift women in different ways. When I was in business, it was mentoring. It was seeing what I could do to make things easier, to being supportive. And most recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, partner and I, Bobby Celeste, we've established women's political leadership circles, which are peer groups for women who are running for office. And so the women in the circle have an opportunity to be with other women who are running at the same time. And so they're able to share information, support each other, leverage the group problem solving, as we say, leverage the wisdom of the circle, and run a race or be in a campaign in a much more comfortable, confident position because of the support they have available to them. So the persistence is really, I think, being involved at whatever level works for you, wherever you are, but at the core of it, again, it's lifting up other women.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to ask Dr. Tina Pierce, John Glenn School of Public Affairs at Ohio State University and Columbus Board of Education member, and I might add, Q's cousin. Your question is, tell us about a time when you didn't share a political party with someone, but you shared a similar end goal. And how were you able to build a coalition, build a consensus? And I suspect that is very true of your role on the school board.
First, please let me thank everybody for, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
First, let me thank everybody for inviting me to engage in this very timely and relevant conversation as we reflect on our past in terms of women obtaining and really challenging for the right to vote, but also look forward to the upcoming election. And so as we think about, again, working with individuals despite partisanship, there's been a variety of different opportunities for me to do that. First and foremost, the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, one of the premier events that we have every year, is Ready to Run. This is an event in which we bring together women from both the Republican, the Democratic, but also those lesser known parties, the Green Party, right? Other parties throughout our state to come together to equip them with the skills, the knowledge, the confidence to connect them with the network so they are motivated, encouraged to run for public office. So that's one of the things that we definitely pride ourselves on at The Ohio State University, our Ready to Run event that is upcoming this year on December 5th. I encourage everybody to please attend that event. Another way, again, where it's not necessary to necessarily share your party, but to focus on the work that we need to do was definitely in my role as a board member for our Columbus Board of Education. And that role, as many individuals throughout our nation right now are dealing with this fact of how do we ensure that students are still learning despite our COVID-19 precautions. We have to put the partisanship aside and really think about the safety of not only our students and staff, but also their families. With this particular infection, this particular disease, we don't know how it affects communities and families. You know, at one point they said, you know, children are okay, they can gather. And then we start to see this research with students, of course, being infected. And so in that role, we want to focus as much as possible on protecting the health and safety of our students and staff, but at the same time, ensuring that we're providing them with opportunities to gain that academic knowledge and to move forward with their goals and dreams.
Very good. I would now like to introduce our Montgomery County Commissioner and my commissioner as well, Deborah Lieberman. And Debbie, I'd like to ask you to tell us what factors you considered in deciding to run for the county commission.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a very interesting story, actually. I was serving on a city council, for those of you in Montgomery County, Clayton, Ohio, and I had run and won both times to city council, and I knew I wanted to do something more. After law school, I stayed here in Dayton because I got a job with a judge. And I really thought I would, from the time I was about 11, I thought I'd be, I wanted to be a prosecutor, an elected prosecutor. Well, after law school and after then going to work for my husband's law firm, I kind of changed my mind about being a prosecutor. And so then, but I knew I wanted to serve. I wanted to be a public servant. And I worked for, after I left legal aid, I went to work for A.J. Wagner. And AJ was the county auditor at the time. Valerie, you were city manager at the time. And AJ always was encouraging all of us in his leadership to do more, to volunteer more, to run for smaller office. So I think at one time in the county auditor's office, we had 7 elected officials that were in leadership with our full-time jobs. So I knew I wanted to do something else. I certainly never grew up wanting to be a county commissioner, but I'll tell you, it's the best thing ever. It's the best thing. And I'm just going to say this as an aside. A couple times that Judy Dodge, hi Judy, I know you're there, that we've had the opportunity to meet Vice President Biden and say that we're county commissioners. He's like, county commissioner, hardest job I ever had. And so, you know, we have that little bond with him. But it's hard, but it's also so rewarding. But when I was asked to run for an open seat, to finally get to your question, sorry, Valerie, it was 2004, and it was an open seat, and Don Lucas was not going to run again. And the Democratic Party didn't have anybody to run. And I was perfectly happy doing what I was doing. 2 young sons, on city council, leadership in the auditor's office. And I couldn't find anybody to run. And so I tell this story because it's almost true. Carl Keith, who is now the county auditor, has been since 2000. And I were the 2 names that people were like, one of you has to do it. So my husband, Dennis, happened to be the chairman of the party at that time. And he's like, one of you 2 has to do this. And so what I tell people is Carl and I spent hours and we arm wrestled and I lost. So I ran and I love it. It was actually fun. So the interesting thing is my opponent was on Kettering City Council at the time, another city in our county. It is Peggy Lehner. And so Peggy and I, which was so fascinating because, you think you're total opposites, but as we were campaigning, we were like, we're not really that different. And for those of you, I'm sure everybody on this call knows who Peggy is, but she's a good friend now, and she's my state senator. So I did beat her. I did win, and she likes telling, like, when we're in front of students, she'll tell that story. She's like, she beat me, But so I ran, and now I'm running again. Judy and I both. My 5th time running for county commissioner. We do have opponents, and this is, of course, the strangest election of any of our lives, right? So it's something, when I was young, I always told people that I wanted to be a prosecutor, but I wanted to be the first woman senator from the state of Indiana. Well, didn't happen, but right now, there's nothing else I'd rather do than be a county commissioner. So it's great, and I love helping other women, young women. They'll call me and say, how can I get involved? What should I do? It's like, get on a board, get on a committee, and that's how you start. So, and that's what I did.
Fantastic, Debbie. Thanks so much. And now I'd like to ask Pat Kavanaugh, who ran in 2019 for the Kettering City Council race. I'd like to ask you to tell us what inspired you to get involved with politics.
Well, it was my first venture into politics. I'm a CPA and a computer programmer, and was happy doing that for quite a while. Retired and got involved with several organizations, one of which is the Daughters of the American Revolution. I found out that I had a lot of ancestors who fought for the freedom of our country, and that kind of inspired me. We had several ladies who were thinking of running for the city council seat, and one by one they all dropped out except me. So I was opposing a man who was wanted to serve his final term, because we're term limited in Kettering, and he had that seat for 32 years. So he was very well known.
Yes.
And I went door to door and met lots and lots of people. It was a very good experience. I'm being encouraged to run again next year for a city council seat. So we'll see how that goes. But it's definitely was an eye-opener getting to know so many people. I will say that it's difficult sometimes to pry some money loose from different folks in order to fund your campaign, particularly when you're not known as a political power, as my opponent was. But again, it's that face-to-face that I think really made the difference, because I only lost by 170 votes. So I really see that as a success with my first foray into politics.
Oh, I think so too. That is an excellent run, and we will all be curious to see if you decide to throw your hat in the race again. And speaking of throwing hats in the race, I do see Montgomery County Commissioner Carolyn Rice. I've got to think women in Montgomery County that we have to be leading the state, leading the country, and the number of women that are in elective office in our county. I think we probably stand pretty good. So we'll have you talk a little bit about that. I see that there are some questions in the queue, and I'm going to ask one to everyone on the panel to get the conversation started, and then Kim will queue us up. And the question for all of the panelists is, where do men belong in this conversation? And Tina, why don't we start with you? And you are muted.
Definitely, as the mother of two sons, I'm always encouraging our young men and men that they play a key role in this discussion in advancing the political power of women. First, we have to acknowledge that young girls often start to show this interest in politics when they're younger. This doesn't happen automatically when they turn 25 and 30 and decide, I want to run for office. This happens when they're in kindergarten, when they decide, I want to run for the treasurer, or I want to run for student council president. And so encouraging our young men to dispel, to fight, to challenge those gender norms or those gender biases that we as a society hold, to say, oh, you can't vote for the girl for president, or you can't vote for her for treasurer. So we have to begin by teaching our young boys that there's a role, there's a place for young girls and women at the table. Definitely, you then, want to move forward to have them out there campaigning and supporting us when we do run for office. My sons, my husband, my male family members are out at parades. They're showing support. They're talking to their male counterparts and colleagues about my value system, about where I stand on key issues. So they're helping to open the door with their peers. And that's critically important because women, we don't operate in some of the spaces that they operate in, but having a male to open the door, walk you in that room and validate you means so much. So men opening that door, helping to validate. When we have strong women candidates running, we always need that. And then we've talked also about the funding aspect. When we look at the fact that there's a clear wage gap, when we look at the wages that women are making versus the wages that men are making, men have disposable income that they can share with women when we're running for office. So we definitely want to encourage them to take that extra money that you're making on the dollar and put it into a woman's campaign when she's running for office.
That sounds great. And I will tell you that women of my generation, our socialization was not that we'd be president, but we could be secretary of our class. So it's great to see that from the beginning, women are thinking more about leading rather than note-taking and following. So that's just great. Janine, can you tell us a little about your thoughts on where men belong in the conversation?
I think what Tina said certainly is accurate, and the thing that I maybe can add is the people who are parents now, I think, have done a good job of raising a younger generation of kids who are much more, let me say this right, colorblind and gender blind than older generations. And I think it's just part of the value set and the belief systems that people are raised with. Because what I find is younger generations are much more open to supporting someone because they share values or because they agree with the direction they're going, as opposed to, well, they're not the right gender or they're not the right race or whatever the case might be. So definitely there's a place. I'm encouraged because I think we're getting closer to that place where gender and race will matter less. How long it will take, to get to a true place of equality, I don't know. Long time, I'm afraid, but we're moving in that direction, and men are definitely part of that.
Fantastic. And Pat, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yes, through my campaign, I was really supported by my husband, who helped me to get out there, to meet people, a lot of encouragement. I have two sons as well, raised them to be respectful of women and encouraging. and they too help me with the campaigning. So I feel like the more that happens, then the more everyone starts to be encouraged more in their campaigns. And it just spreads the word and helps people to realize that women are able and certainly are out there. So we need to vote for them.
And Debbie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think more and more, and especially in the workplace and government, I think that, of course, we have 3 female county commissioners, as you said, but I think that like-minded men are great allies. They can be really great allies for us and fight for us. With 2 millennial sons, they've never known me not to be an elected official. So in, the way that they think, they don't even think, and I think that was a great point, that in this generation, the younger people, they don't even think that there should be a difference, right? So I'm very hopeful that not only in politics, but in the workplace and in society in general, that we can reduce what is still there. We know it's still there. I mean, obviously there are so many gender inequality issues that we've probably each of us shared many times, but I think as men and women understand the barriers that women and minorities face in society, that we can make it a lot better. So I'm hopeful, very hopeful.
Sounds great.
And right. And I think Kamala helps a lot. I think it's great.
Oh, yes, I think so. Kim, I see a queue is growing, so please.
The queue is growing, absolutely. So, first of all, with the Matriots PAC, we have 63 candidates that we have endorsed and supported for this 2020 election, 21 of whom are in Southwest Ohio, including Debbie Lieberman here. And we are so appreciative of having you throw your hats into the ring and step up. One of the questions that was first asked is that, why is it taking so long for the U.S. to elect a woman president while other countries already have female leaders? Anyone like to take that?
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
And I don't know that this has to do so much with the role of president as maybe it does with the campaign model that we have. The campaign model that we have in this country is designed for men, run for men, developed for men. And what I mean by that is it's developed and created by people who have wives and who have a lot of things taken care of and taken off their plate, who have employers who are completely supportive with respect to the campaigns, and who are part of the Good Old Boy Network. Now, this is not to disparage in any way women who have run for office and been elected. What I am saying is that the steepness of doing that for women who are not well supported, who have no other tools than are typically given to candidates, is not enough. Those things are not enough to help women move ahead at a faster rate. My partner and I have worked with 4 groups of women who are running for office. And if a race is not one that is pretty close to a guarantee to win, the support for that race can be minimal. And in Ohio, we work with a lot of districts that are heavily gerrymandered. And so there are a number of races where women have stepped up. They want to lead, they want to participate, they want to make a better society, yet the support for them is not there because, maybe it's because resources are finite, I don't know. But what I am saying is that we need to look at providing more to women who are looking to be successful in politics, because the model that we have now is not supportive of women. We're doing things, the Matriots, the kinds of gatherings that we have in terms of providing support, getting more women involved and active. But I think there's maybe even a trickle-up effect here. You know, how long do you go, and how many years do you have to pay your dues, quote unquote, before you were even considered? So, just my opinion. It's a long slog.
It's
a long slog.
And if I could add to that, you're really pointing out your opinion really aligns with what research shows. And there's a number of things that we need to consider. And the first is, I encourage everybody to watch the film Misrepresentation. That film really points out again how when young girls start to express interest in politics, that sometimes those gendered bias and those gendered norms, as they move from elementary to middle school to high school, that interest starts to wane because people begin to tell them, women aren't in that space. You shouldn't be interested in finance and budgeting and national security and things of those natures, right? Because research shows it's this idea of there's certain offices that women should run for, that women will win when they run for, right? So there's a great research book that says a woman's place is in the house because women are more likely to win house races. Women are more likely to win races for school board. But when it comes to the Senate, when it comes to, let's talk about national security, right? You're going to see this kind of, should you be there? Is that your place? Is that your role? And so I think we have not seen women, advance into these top level roles, president, vice president, is because one, we're not encouraging young girls to keep that interest in politics when they start to show that interest. We're not building a strong bench. When we see young girls that are interested in politics, we need to create programs that help them understand and learn parliamentary procedure, Robert's rules, the skills that they need to run effective campaigns and to be effective legislatures and elected officials. And then also, there's also research that shows for women to run for office, you have to ask them 3 times. Men, you ask 1 time and they're, yes, I'll run, but women,
They're
this calculation in our head, like, oh, should I run? And it takes an individual really 3 times being asked to run for office before many of us have the confidence to run. And it's interesting because I've studied this as a graduate student and wrote a dissertation that focused on, governance and women, and found myself in that same position. When I was asked the first time, I did this calculation, and then my friends came back and asked me again and brought more people with them. And it took 3 times for me to say yes. So even knowing that, I still fell victim to that exact pattern.
One last thing to add about it, and the other countries. So the question was, why have other countries? Well, their elections, first of all, aren't as long as ours, and they're not as costly as ours. And so this last time in the primary, we had a lot of great women to choose from. But I think I don't know that the men in this country are ready for a woman president. They're going to get one eventually here. We know that. But I think when you look at other countries and the presidents that are there, there's not even a second thought that they have a woman president. I mean, in fact, I know that Commissioner Shannon Jones is on the call, and she and I were fortunate, almost 2 years ago now, we were able to go to Germany and at the invitation of Angela Merkel, and we celebrated their 100th of the women in Germany getting the right to vote, so their suffrage. So I think that, and the parties there are so different too. I mean, so there isn't just 2 parties in almost every country over there. We know that, and so I think there's just been a greater acceptance of women as president.
During my working career, I was mostly in occupations that were male dominated, accounting and IT. And even though I was as skilled as they were, there were a lot of times where, basically I was told, don't overstep. And I think the same thing happens in politics. Women get told, take your place. This isn't where you belong. And as women, a lot of times I think we tend to internalize that and maybe step back when instead of stepping forward and saying, no, I do belong here. You need to step back. But money plays a huge role. I mean, our campaigns are so money oriented, particularly at the national level. The amount that's spent on presidential races, to me, is really insane. It's just TV advertising that people get sick and tired of seeing. I don't think it changes a lot of minds, but it's just, we got to throw more and more and more money at it. I think that really needs to be reined in. If there was constraints placed on how much could be spent, I think it would make the race more fair, both for men and women.
So let's talk a little bit about, not at the national level, but just even here at the state level, and money in politics here in Ohio, and how that plays out in terms of races. There's some research that suggests that women have a harder time asking for money. And when they do ask for money, they tend to get less of it. And women tend to be less apt to be the ones signing checks to give to candidates. So all of those things kind of come into play. Can we talk a little bit about, and again, coming from the PAC perspective, money's always on my mind. Can we talk a little bit about that? Or no?
Well, the money played a big role in my race. My opponent outspent me by 5 times what I was able to spend. He had hundreds and hundreds of signs throughout a rather small district. And so that name recognition, I think alone is probably what got him reelected. And I see that in a lot of other races too, where the money that's spent on signs and advertising is what really wins the race. And if you don't have the funds, then you're going to lose.
Janine, we saw you about to say something, please.
Well, if we're not going to change the laws in terms of spending money and how it's spent, then we have to look at different ways of accomplishing things. One of the things I don't know that we've heard referenced a lot has to do with the mental and emotional drain that a campaign has on women. Not saying it doesn't have it on men, but my experience shows me what it does to women. And as a gender, women are much less confident in themselves. They are much less confident in their ability to withstand not being part of the old boys network, or being told you haven't paid enough dues yet. We've had people in our circles who have experienced those things. That's not unusual. And so women who enter campaigns or go into campaigns need to get messages around right up front. And I don't know what the messages are, but they need to be consistent. I think maybe that's it, throughout the whole campaign. And so why we find the support of a peer group so critical is that there's an understanding among those people in there that fundraising is soul sucking. It is going to be that way. You cannot avoid it. You must do it. So pick yourself up and get back to it. If you don't have that kind of voice talking in your ear, it's very easy not to pick up the phone and make that call. It's very easy not to make a connection that you know you should make. And and that's not because women don't have the moxie, because we certainly do. But I do believe that as a gender, we need a different kind of emotional, maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's mental backing that is more continuous than what we have available for women in the middle of a campaign, during a campaign.
You know, Janine, a colleague of mine talked about muscle memory. So maybe we need to start practicing things and help our muscles remember that we will need to learn those strategies and tactics and incorporate them into our essence. As we are winding down, I would like to ask our panelists to each have the last word for the evening. So Debbie, you want to kick us off with any thoughts or comments you want to pass along?
Well, sure. I was just going to add a little bit about that, because I am in, Judy and I and some others are right in the middle, and thank you, Matriots, for your endorsement of us. But raising money it's hard. I don't mind raising money for other events or organizations, but it is hard. And men do not have that same problem we have. And maybe not all women, maybe I'm just talking for myself, but I've had an opponent every single one of my 7 elections. And it's not easy. And and I appreciated what you were just saying about, you get in the middle of it and you got to raise money. And what I think for us, one of the hardest things is when people are like, oh, you don't need to worry about it. You don't need to worry about it. Well, really, every single campaign, I think every campaign that I've ever, except on Clayton Council, I've had to raise, anywhere from 200,000 to 150. I mean, because we do have to do it. If we want to stay where we are and we want to keep doing the work that we're doing and the good work that we're doing for our county, we got to do it. So in closing, I just say this was great. It was, I'm so disappointed that we weren't able to, not just as a region or a state or a country, really celebrate the 100 years the way we had all thought we were going to a year ago right now. But this was nice, and it was really good for everybody to get together and learn a little bit and share with each other. So thank you, Matriots.
Fantastic, thank you. And Tina, please.
And so I'll just add a little bit of that as well. When we think about the important role that money plays in our campaigns, having an organization such as the Matriots that is throughout our local governance structure is critically important, because it's allowing women to build political power at the local, state, and federal level. We're preparing candidates and we're giving them that money that they so desperately need to get their names out there, to buy those signs. And then also you're building a network of not just other women who are running for office, but women that are supporting the candidates that are running for office. Women that are going to send you the email to say, hang in there and keep going while you're campaigning. So that's critically important. And the one thing that I guess I would like to leave us all with as we walk out of this conversation is, when we think about how different our world is now, how different our world will be given COVID-19, let's continue to disrupt these systems and think of new and innovative ways to support women in their campaign, to support young girls when they show that interest in politics. Now is the time. Let's continue to keep the momentum going strong and help one another again to build our political power for women.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Janine.
Just a thank you to everyone who took time to participate tonight. Thank you to the Matriots and to the Dayton folks for getting behind this and creating this event. It's so energizing to see this many people talking about a subject that is so important, spending time with it. And I just encourage, I guess, everyone as a final thought to see what little thing you can do to add to the persistence. Because as we saw in that wonderful slide program, it took lots of years of persistence to, get to the passage of suffrage. And so it continues to take lots of years, but the more that participate, I think the more opportunity we have to move things along. So whatever support you can provide, however you can uplift a woman, particularly running for office, thank you in advance for doing that.
Fantastic. And Pat?
Well, I hope that we use this 100th anniversary of women's suffrage to kick us off and encourage more and more women to run, encourage more women to and men to support women candidates. I think the publicity, even though we can't really go and celebrate the way we wanted to, I'm hopeful that just getting the word out will help the whole process and encourage more and more women to run.
Fantastic. I really want to give just a round of applause to our panel. We so appreciate your taking the time. But before you leave, I really would ask Diane, if you could say kind of a closing comment on behalf of the league.
Well, vote, of course. That's what the league's all about. But I just wanted to second what Janine was saying, persistence. And, it wasn't too long ago that the league, after years and years and years of trying, got issue 1 on the ballot and passed overwhelmingly in all 88 counties to take the first steps to address gerrymandering in Ohio. And so we can't give up, we just got to keep working at it and being as inventive and working around systems. If you can't work through it, work around it, do whatever you can do to support good politics.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Diane. Brady.
Valerie?
Yes, just to say goodbye.
Yes, well, thank you very much for joining us here, and I hope everybody can make it out to Carillon Park and see this exhibit. And fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed hearing everybody's comments, and I found it very interesting. So thank you.
The benefit of venues like this is that we have the opportunity at least to see one another since we're in person, and we really appreciate your taking your dinner time to spend with us, sharing your thoughts and candid ideas. Please take a look at the chat box if you haven't had the opportunity to do so already. And we appreciate you. We love you, and we are just so proud of the work that all of you are doing. And Kim, you will have the last word before we say goodnight.
So I cannot tell you how inspired I am by the history that we've seen tonight. To listen to women who've chosen to continue that history and run for office right now, to step into the arena, and the courage that takes is not anything. It cannot be overstated, and we are so happy to support you in that, to stand behind you, and to send you daily emails during the campaigns, which we know, Janine, our candidates appreciate so much, for the reason that it can be desperately difficult to do this work. So thank you, everyone who's came to listen. Thank you for everyone who continues to persist. Right? And thank you for the work of the league and history, and everyone in office. And onward to November, we have 63, and each one of them should win. 63 endorsed women candidates. So look out for them, vote for them. Tomorrow, we have another fantastic event. So we'd like to invite all of you to come back to the Matriots continued education. And we're going to talk about gerrymandering tomorrow night, and how gerrymandering impacts women running for office. Sometimes it's called gendermandering, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We are nonpartisan, and we really are about making sure that everyone has the opportunity to step up and fight for their communities.
And Bootsy Neal and Ryan McClellan will be on the call tomorrow at what time? 5:30?
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow at 5:30. Have a wonderful evening, and God bless.
Thank you.